public and it is being recorded. The recording will be posted later on NIH and EPPICnet websites so that it will be available for others to view. Please save all questions to the end. Hopefully we'll address a lot of the questions during the webinar itself. And you can also use the chat feature on WebEx to send us some questions, but we'll try to handle the questions at the very end. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information on the EPPICnet application process for those who may have drug, device, or other assets that we could consider for study in EPPICnet, and to go over the submission and the review process for those applications. We really do not want this to be a discussion about specific assets or about specific applicants. We will deal with those privately and confidentially at another time. You can always call or email EPPICnet staff. I will have the contact information at the end of the presentation for that. The first thing is I will introduce myself. I'm Barbara Karp. I am the Program Director for EPPICnet. I'm a neurologist by training. I have some experience in pain in that I've been the PI of a study on botulinum toxin for chronic pelvic pain and endometriosis. So that's my limited background on pain. And I will do presentation, but we will also have presentations by Dr. Rebecca Baker, the director of the NIH HEAL initiative, by Dr. Marilyn Morhoon, our review officer, and by Lori Roman from ERA Commons, which is the submission system that we are using for the applications. So Dr. Baker, are you online? She can unmute herself. I'm not seeing.
She's here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. So Rebecca, would you like to be, can you take over now?
Can you hear me, Barbara?
Yes, we can. And
great.
I will advance the slides for you.
Okay, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be at this milestone where we have now built the infrastructure for this very exciting early phase investigation clinical network, or EPPICnet, and are ready to start the process of seeing what interesting opportunities are out there and moving forward with the network, which is a very important part of the HEAL initiative. So the HEAL initiative, helping to end addiction long-term, is really a trans-NIH effort with two primary goals. First, to improve prevention and treatment strategies for opioid misuse and addiction, and secondly, because we know that the use of opioids puts individuals at risk for opioid dependence and addiction, to enhance pain management strategies, provide effective, safe, non-addictive pain management strategies to people who currently do not have them. That includes people with different pain conditions, people who's been actively managed by opioids, such as many patients with chronic pain. So together, these efforts to provide scientific solutions to the opioid crisis, and this is an effort that NIH has undertaken together with our Department of Health and Human Services under the guidance of the HHS Secretary, as well as federal partners in the Food and Drug Administration and SAMHSA and CMS, as well as local government officials and communities that are fighting the opioid crisis on the ground. So to provide a brief overview to the HEAL initiative, has a yearly budget of $500 million a year because we were
the mute function. Let me just fix that.
So the yearly budget is approximately $500 million, and yet because we received our first increment pretty late in the fiscal year of 2018, we actually have nearly $1 billion to spend in fiscal year 2019, which is the end of which is coming upon us close. And there are many, many components of HEAL. EPPICnet is one important component, but there are 26 different research programs within the initiative being led by 12 different institutes and centers. So not just the Neurology Institute, but arthritis and musculoskeletal diseases, and National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, and many of the different places where pain is part of an institute's mission. So we recognize that pain kind of cuts across the human health spectrum. And so we've recruited to be part of the HEAL initiative experts from across NIH and experts from across the different research communities that come to play when we're dealing with patients with pain. To support this array of research efforts, many of which span the research continuum from basic to translational to clinical trials, all the way to implementation science, bringing solutions to people where they are and where they're seeking treatment. We've released over 40 different funding opportunity announcements in fiscal year 2019, and we're really coming to the point where we're about ready to make awards in the month of September for all of, in response to all of these different announcements. Here you'll see the two primary goals, enhancing pain management and improving treatments for misuse and addiction within the HEAL initiative, and 6 different focus areas where the HEAL initiative is putting forward dedicated efforts. And this includes efforts to expand therapeutic options for the management and treatment of opioid use disorder and the prevention of overdose, new medications for craving and enhanced dose agents. It also includes research on new improved prevention and treatment strategies. How can we prevent at-risk use? How can we prevent people with opioid misuse but not full-blown use disorder from progressing to addiction? So some dedicated research strategies in that area. A number of really innovative research efforts in the area of optimizing effective treatments or implementation science, efforts in the criminal justice system and the whole community level to bring to bear all the different interventions that we know to be evidence-based to help prevent overdose and treat use disorder, as well as some focused efforts. I think we're not done. Can you please go back one, Barbara? Some focused efforts on newborns, so infants born exposed to opioids, what treatment can we give them, and how can we track them in the long term. So that's the misuse and addiction elements of HEAL. We also have an enhancing management component, which is what you'll hear about today, both preclinical and translational research to develop new targets, biomarkers, and models for testing pain before it gets to the clinic. And then what you'll hear more about today, the clinical research and pain management. So now please advance. In the area of the helping to end addiction clinical research and pain management, we have research underway to characterize populations of patients with different pain conditions. A lot of times, analgesic development efforts are focused on a small handful of common conditions, but there are a lot of people out there with pain that is not managed, can be high impact, and is not effectively treated with the options we have available. We're also working through this early phase investigation clinical network, which Barbara will tell you all about, EPPICnet, to test novel treatments in the new clinical trials network. And this will be done together with one of our other focused clinical research efforts, the Back Pain Research Consortium, which focuses on back pain specifically. But then in addition to these kind of expanding the novel treatments, we'll also have efforts underway to establish best practices for the management of both acute and chronic pain through effectiveness research and through some pragmatic implementation studies for the management of pain. So I think the last slide is just an overview of, oh, no, maybe it's not there anymore. Pardon me. I'll end by saying we have in the HEAL initiative a large number of different research studies, but the one that you'll hear about today has been there from the beginning, and it's one that we're really excited about because we think it has the potential to really advance the number of options out there for people with pain. And so I will then hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Barbara.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. So I would like to now take you through some of the information on EPPICnet. As Rebecca just described, The reach of HEAL is across uh, a large group of studies and a large group of initiatives focused on pain and addictions. NIDA is taking the lead for the addictions part of the HEAL initiative. NINDS is taking the lead for the pain programs. And this is a chart of where we have programs across the entire spectrum of research, from discovery all the way through implementation and dissemination, so that you can see where EPPICnet sits. So EPPICnet sits right at the crux of the transition from translational research into clinical trials. The goals of EPPICnet are really to provide academic and industry investigators with a pre-established expert infrastructure support to carry out early phase clinical testing of pain therapeutics. We want to make sure that we're testing pain therapeutics across a broad spectrum of pain patients and pain conditions and across the lifespan. And this fits in with the HEAL initiatives of trying to develop non-addictive pain therapeutics to help address the opiate crisis. We're interested in all kinds of pain therapeutics, not just drugs, but in the device domain as well. So EPPICnet is going to be testing new pain treatments, compounds, and devices that are judged highly meritorious through a peer review process. We're looking to bring in compounds or drugs or devices from industry, academia. If they can come from elsewhere, that would be great also. And we're targeted at research, but we have some flexibility in terms of where things are along the early phase spectrum. We want to incentivize and accelerate the phase 2 trials, reduce the time to start, enroll, run, and complete the trials. We really want to focus not on pain in general, but on well-defined pain conditions that really currently lack effective treatments. As part of that, and as part of our infrastructure, we are looking to provide well-characterized patient pain cohorts for these clinical trials, but we'll incorporate deep phenotyping into the studies as well. We're looking to provide proof of concept testing for potential biomarkers, as well as the new non-addictive treatments, and to validate those biomarkers, both in terms of pain outcomes and in terms of assessing targeting treatment. And finally, we want to introduce some research novelty into this as well by trying to develop innovative clinical trial paradigms for this. As Rebecca mentioned, there is a backpack consortium in NIAMS, the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Conditions. Backpack is partnered with EPPICnet, so that there may be trials focused on low back pain that come in through NIAMS that are appropriate for studying in EPPICnet. So we will have an integrated approach, since back pain is one of the drivers of opiate use in the United States. The information and the links on Backpack can be found on the slide. So what are some of the advantages of this network setup? It's aimed to increase trial quality. It allows us to balance the portfolio so that we can prioritize studies, so that the studies do not compete with each other for patients or for research capacity. It gives us stable funding for the infrastructure. We also will have mesh all of the research findings through a single data center with uniform governance, quality assurance, the use of common data elements, required data sharing. HEAL is going to be setting up a central data repository for all HEAL studies, and EPPICnet will contribute to that repository. We are also setting up a biosample repository for all of HEAL, and that will also include consent for broad sharing. And again, it will help us manage competition and minimize competition among studies and among patients. It'll allow us to coordinate with all of our partners, and also we've incorporated training for new neuroscientists. This is a diagram of the network structure specifically for EPPICnet. So HEAL and NIH and NINDS provide leadership and oversight of all components of the network. The asset providers are going to interact mostly with NIH and then with the Clinical Coordinating Center, which really sits at the center of our network. The Clinical Coordinating Center then interacts with the Data Coordinating Center, hubs and their spokes, and with the PI who will be selected from among the investigators. And I'll go over the function of each of these components. So the Clinical Coordinating Center is going to manage the centralized IRB agreements. There will be a single IRB for these trials with IRB reliance agreements with each of the centers. There will be master trial agreements that govern the conduct of each trial, managed by the Clinical Coordinating Centers with all of the hubs and spokes. The hubs and their spokes are the actual research sites. The Clinical Coordinating Center will be charged with matching the study to the hubs, spokes, and investigators with the best fit expertise and patient population to run that particular trial. So they'll identify that staff and they will train the investigators and staff in the study methodology. They'll standardize the CRFs, the common data elements. And they'll work very closely with the Data Coordinating Center, develop the operating procedures and quality controls. And they will also distribute the funding with NIN oversight to the various clinical sites to run the study itself. The Coordinating Center is going to receive, process, standardize, and centralize the data, provide statistical analysis and reports, analyze the data from across all HEAL studies, monitor safety, provide reporting to the DSMB and other monitors, create the EPPICnet data repository and the HEAL biorepository. The clinical hubs and spokes are where the research is done. They'll conduct the trial, they'll identify individual investigators and collect and report the individual level data to the DCC and the CCC. NIH is providing the assets. We interact with everybody involved, provide oversight, and oversee the budget and the milestones. There are two mechanisms for funding involved in EPPICnet. One is by cooperative agreements, and the other is by other transaction authorities. So the funding for the infrastructure components are U24 cooperative agreements. So now we get into the part of why we're all here. We would like to invite applications for assets to be studied within EPPICnet. We're open for applications on September 3rd. We're looking for non-addictive therapeutics for targeted pain conditions that currently lack adequate treatment. We will consider all types of therapeutics and all types of pain conditions. I mentioned we want to have studies that address pain across the age spectrum, including pediatric and geriatric populations. We will consider assets for proof of concept testing. We can consider marketed and repurposed drugs. We are targeting phase 2 ready with existing IND, IDE compounds or devices, but we have some flexibility and we don't want to tell you not to talk to us if your drug or device is not FDA approved or FDA or IND in place already. It's important to know that the asset, the intellectual property, remain the property of the asset owner. We will have confidentiality agreements implemented as we need them, and there will be a written technology transfer agreement to define the relationship between EPPICnet and the asset owner. So we will work out the role of the asset owner in each study, and we'll put in place a written agreement defining that relationship. The application process itself has 3 stages. It was designed to allow us to progressively hone in on the details and the trial and get a feel very early on for whether or not an asset is ready to move forward. So the preliminary application and submission is the first stage. The second stage we're calling dossier preparation, submission, and that gets reviewed. And the third stage is the actual protocol preparation, submission, and review. Studies and assets that come through all three stages, highly rated, are then put for funding, assignment to the clinical sites, and implementation. This is another schematic of the process and how it really fits in. So we have the preliminary application with the proposal from the asset owner. That goes for objective review. The applications that are highly rated through the review process are then invited to work with a contractor NIH already has in place to develop a dossier application. The dossier hones in on more specific information. I'll give you more details about that in a minute. Highly rated dossiers are then referred to the Clinical Coordinating Center. That's the down arrow from Review 2. The Clinical Coordinating Center works with the DCC, the hubs, and the asset owner to develop the clinical protocol. The clinical protocol then gets submitted for stage 3 review. The highly rated protocols at stage 3 are then budgeted and a timeline proposed, and then they go forward for implementation in the network. And we're hoping that we will develop assets that really come through EPPICnet and will be pursued for later phase 3 clinical trials and drug development. So we want to be really explicit that there is no funding associated with the first 2 stages of application. Preliminary application is just some brief information about the asset and the proposed study. There is no award associated with that. The dossier step is a more in-depth review with applicant and the NINS contractor preparing the dossier, but there's no funding associated with that. That goes on to the highly rated dossiers, then go on to clinical trial protocol development. The applicant is the Clinical Coordinating Center along with the other elements of the network and the applicant, and that is the stage that will be funded as if it comes through review. After review, objective review, the final approval comes from HEAL and the NINS Council. So there's a final approval step after it comes through the clinical protocol objective review. The funding for the clinical trials themselves comes from an authority NIH has called Other Transaction Authority. Other transactions are not, they're not cooperative agreements and they're not contracts. They're their own funding mechanism that gives NIH some flexibility in how to use funds. So just to be aware that this is not a grant. The OT funds go through the Clinical Coordinating Center. The Clinical Coordinating Center then distributes the funds to the hubs and spokes as they're needed for the conduct of the trial. So the asset owner doesn't get the funds directly. The asset owner gets access to EPPICnet for the clinical trial of their asset. We have our preliminary application packet available on websites. You can just search EPPICnet or HEAL and you'll find it. The preliminary application packet includes 4 elements. There's an information sheet that has contact addresses and information on how to use the packet and on the application process overall. There's the preliminary application itself, which is a fillable PDF form. There are line-by-line instructions for completing the preliminary application. And because the application gets submitted via ERA Commons, we have the instructions for submission through ERA Commons as well. What the preliminary application looks like, you can see that it's, I'm just showing you the kind of top of the form. We're going to ask for applicant information, asset information, freedom to operate, which is whether or not the applicant actually has the asset available and authority to submit it. They ask about the biological rationale for some brief overview of the current availability of data, preclinical and clinical data, proposed indication, the proposed treatment regimen and outcome measures, the FDA regulatory status, and then some feasibility concerns. So here, the applications that pass through the preliminary stage will then not ranked, but will be evaluated for whether or not they proceed on to the dossier stage. So the application selected through the review process will work with our contractor to prepare the dossier. The dossier goes into much more detail about the scientific rationale, the unmet need, the target product profile, target disease connection, preclinical data for drugs and biological history, manufacturer, for device, the device specifications, biology, pharmacology, considerations for the HEAL program. The dossier applications then go through independent review again, and they will then work with the EPPIC infrastructure if they are selected for the next stage. They go to the clinical coordinating center to prepare the protocol application along with a budget and timeline. The is going to be based on the protocol template that NIH developed along with the FDA. It will have the full trial information and plan. It will address human subjects protections issues and equitability. Stage 3 applicant is the clinical coordinating center in coordination with the asset owner. So now I would like to turn things over to Dr. Marilyn Morhoon, who's going to talk about the review process and the review criteria. Yes. You can do the down button yourself.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the review process is going to go for this. So, this thing to get across, many of you are familiar with the NIH review process, and objective reviews that will be done for this are not using the standard NIH process. The standard process right now, when you submit an investigator-initiated R01, from the time you submit until the time it passes through council and funding can occur, up to 9 months. And we're trying to make this much more nimble. To a slide from earlier, what I'm going to be talking about here is that talking about the objective review. This is not going over what the HEAL multidisciplinary working group is going to be looking at or the executive committee. This is just what the reviewers will be doing in that stages for stages 1, 2, and 3 of the application process. The goals we have for doing the objective review are to get expert input from NINDS HEAL to NIH staff about the merit of the therapeutics that are being considered. We want this to be a very fast and streamlined review process. Our goal is not to have a consensus agreement or a discussion of scores on the applications. It's really a focused scientific discussion about the merit of the therapeutics, the strengths and weaknesses of the therapeutics, comments about the biological rationale, and we're not managing conflicts of interest per NIH policy, but we're using that policy as a guide. We're not going to be having people from the institution reviewing therapeutics from the institution. Thank you. And we'll also be keeping track of, who's submitted and who's collaborated with who to make sure that there is some impartiality that's occurring in these reviews. It's going to consist of close to 30 core members now. We have a really fantastic group of people who have a lot of experience in this area. This will be the same core panel for all 3 stages of the review, although because these reviews are probably going to be happening on a monthly basis, We're not expecting all the core members to attend all the meetings, so that group will fluctuate a little bit from meeting to meeting. We will also be bringing in additional ad hoc reviewers to cover different areas of expertise, perhaps to cover rigor of data, and to cover different methodologies that might be used. As the therapeutics move through the different stages, we're also going to be on appropriate expertise. So we might have somebody with a clinical bend for the initial preliminary application review, definitely going to have a much more clinical trial focused group looking at applications that are proposing the stage 3 clinical trials. The review timeline is that for all stages will be that the review should be completed within 2 months of receipt. This is a little bit of a guess, and I'm hoping actually that it's going to be a shorter timeline. As applications are going to be submitted on a rolling basis, meeting cutoff dates are going to be posted on EPPICnet. And so, for example, with the proposed September 3rd deadline for beginning acceptance applications, we'll probably give about a month to October 1st to collect a group of applications. And then once we have that good group of about a month, we'll then plan a meeting. That will be our cutoff. And any applications that are received after that time point will go to the following meeting. Depending on the number of applications we have and the number of reviewers I need to bring together in the room, the application will occur anywhere from 2 weeks to a month after that cutoff date. The other thing that's very different from a standard NIH review is that summary statements are not going to be provided. Feedback is really focusing on the therapeutics of interest. That feedback is going to be given to NIH staff, and they will communicate with the applicants about the outcome of the review. The applications before the review meeting will be binned into 3 main bins. And we want to get kind of the key strengths and weaknesses from the reviewers of each of the application. And the bins are going to be green, meritorious, yellow, meritorious, but there's some concerns noted, and red, not deemed meritorious. And basically anything in the green and yellow we're hoping to have discussed, unless reviewers feel strongly one way or the other about the application. Reviewers are going to be guided to focus on these bins. We really want the highly meritorious therapeutics to rise to the top and get the focus of the reviewer's attention. At the review meeting, we'll talk about the specific review criteria, which will be discussed in the research opportunity announcement, which will be put on the NIH EPPICnet webpage. There's only 3 criteria for the preliminary stage of review, and focusing on the significance, the approach, and the viability and feasibility of the therapeutic for treatment of COVID. These are the questions that will be asked of the reviewers to consider when they're looking at these preliminary applications. They're looking at the targeting of specific pain types, the unmet therapeutic needs, whether there's going to be an improvement over existing pain therapies. The pain therapeutic field in general will be advanced. The approach is a little bit more detailed and a few more questions that we're asking. For instance, we want a therapeutic that's potentially scalable, could easily move from the 3rd stage into clinical trials fairly quickly. So there are things about scalability and availability, consideration of the timeline for bringing this asset to clinical trial, consideration of different methodologies or approaches being proposed, and whether there's any safety or biohazard considerations. And viability and feasibility is really kind of the bigger package as to whether these 2 things fit together and whether it's appropriate for the proposed indication, whether the phase 2 clinical trial that's being proposed is appropriate and worthwhile to move forward, and whether there are any barriers to potentially moving that asset forward. There's also going to be consideration of safety and regulatory aspects of the applications. So stage 2 and stage 3 will also have this very short turnaround objective review. Again, it will be the same review panel with additional ad hocs. Make sure that we're covering the science, the rigor, the methodology at the appropriate stage. There'll be different criteria matched for each of the stages. And so if somebody has a meritorious application at the end of the first stage and they've developed the dossier, they will have in that funding announcement for developing the dossier the information about what will be the review criteria for that next stage of the review. The stage 3 clinical trial protocols are actually going to be reviewed fairly closely to NIH standard reviews, in that we have to cover things like protection of human subjects, inclusion across the lifespan, but we are going to retain that very brief turnaround for the review cycle and try to get these turned around within 2 months of receiving the protocol. So in theory, if an application comes in and it has 2 months for the first stage review, 2 months for the next stage, and then 30 days development for the protocol and another 30 days, hopefully within 9 months, we're looking at, fingers crossed, being able to get an asset, initial application through to implementing the clinical trial within the EPPIC infrastructure. So now we're going to pass it over to Lori Roman. And Lori, you're probably going to have to unmute yourself.
Know when you're ready, and I will advance the slides.
Dossier.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Welcome. So I'm Laura Roman. I'm from the Office of Extramural Research from ERA, and I'm just going to take a few minutes here to walk you through the application process. So next slide, please. The first thing, the registrations for this process have been considerably streamlined. So first, the submitting organization must be registered at ERA Commons. This is a one-time registration. We have streamlined that process so the DUNS is not required. You will need one and hopefully more people that have the role of signing a. We do realize that people get sick and go on vacation, so it's good to have more than one individual have that role, and that is signature authority for that organization. And then lastly, in terms of registrations, we require that one person, not this person's EPPI, have Commons ID and then be affiliated with the submitting organization, and we are providing instructions on how to carry out those registrations. Next slide, please. To submit, we're asking you to use Assist with the NIH's system-to-system solution. We think it fits within the whole philosophy of this program of having things streamlined. And so you can prepare, submit, and track your application in a single system. The submission process, as we've indicated, is very simple in terms of a streamlined form. There is a single form that captures information about the applicant organization, and their contact information, and then a place to add attachments. And these are the documents that Barbara has mentioned earlier. We will ask that you use the funding opportunity announcement, or ROA, that will be available to you on September 3rd. And if the PI has already completed their ERA Commons or chooses to complete full personal profile, they can leverage their Commons ID and repopulate fields within the application. Next slide, please. So this is basically a screenshot of the landing page in Assist, where you will enter this opportunity announcement. We give you an example of the format that should be used. Clicking on the button Enter next to it will take you to a screenshot in the bottom. Next slide. And this is basically the landing page, where you'll see information about the ROA, when it's due, when it closes. And the only information that we require the user to enter on this form is title, and this can be edited later. The PI should be entered their credentials or their name. If they have an ERA Commons name they wish to enter at this time, they can repopulate. Otherwise, just the last name, first name works, and then initiating the application, which is the blue bar down at the bottom. Next slide. Thanks. And so you can see now, looking at the top part of the screen, that the whole application is consolidated into 2 tabs. The summary, which is a screenshot down below, gives information about the applicant's project title that was entered in the PI, the status of the application, and then more importantly, if you don't want to complete the application in a single sit-down, we give you a unique identifier that will allow you to find this application later in Assist when you want to go back and work on it further. Looking at the the arrow on the left-hand side, these are the navigation panes that will allow you to navigate through Assist. And so if you ever get lost, you can hit the Return to Application button. That'll take you back to the landing page displaying the two tabs. Manage Access allows you to allow other folks to work on the application with you. Preview the current form will generate a PDF of the application image, and this will be just as the reviewers see it. We will assemble all the attachments that you've added to the application, and they can be viewed as the reviewer will see it. Validate the application checks for any data fields that are required on the form that have not been completed, and any duplicate file names. And then of course, you can always check the status and update the status from our work in progress to ready to submit. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick view of part of the form. To access or to do data entry, the user will click Edit. This effectively then protects the application from being edited by anyone else. Following data entry at any time, you can hit Save and Keep Lock, and again, that'll keep it in a protected mode so that people cannot enter data on top of one another. And you can also save and release, which will then grant access back to anyone else who has been given access to the application. Next slide. This is just a screenshot of sort of the bottom aspect of the form, and this is where you'll be adding all of the attachments. There are basically allowed several hundred. Hopefully that will not be required for this application. And we give you the opportunity to view the application, the application or the attached files, as well as to update that as replaced. And the only restriction here is those attachments must be PDF. Next. When you've completed your application, you need to go to Status, Update Submission Status, seen on the left-hand side. This will give you a dialog box with a pull down, and then the application can be selected as ready to submit. Hitting the Submit button will require the SO, the signing official, to enter their credentials. Again, they have the authority to submit on the behalf of the organization. So the SO is the person that will be doing the submitting. And then when you submit this submission process, next slide, bypasses .gov, all of the other kinds of places where normal grants and contracts go, and will be processed directly by our system. By checking the status button, you can follow the progress of the application through the whole submission and assembly process. And here you can see we give you a agency tracking number that if you click on that, will be taken to ERA status, where you can look at the assembled grant image. So that's all I have. I'll turn it back to Barb.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to make sure that we discuss the ERA Commons aspect because it's a little bit different than the submission process for grants that you all may be used to. So I would just like to kind of follow up with our timeline. As we mentioned, we're opening for our preliminary application submission and review now. We are hoping on this rather aggressive timeline, which kind of keeps getting compressed, that we may be able to get through the entire review process over the next 4 to 6 months for our first trial through and be prepared to start funding our trials early in 2020. Here is our contact information. To complete the application process in ERA Commons, you will need a research opportunity announcement number, ROA. That will not be available until we open on September 3rd. It will be found on the website, and we will mail it out to anybody who is on our mailing list, so that you will need that number to submit your application. And I've listed here our EPPIC contacts. the HEAL website and the contacts for ERA Commons if you need assistance with any of those.
So this is Marilyn. I just wanted to clarify something I said earlier about conflicts of interest. We are not held to NIH standards for standard review conflict of interest policies. However, we are going to manage things as close as we can to those policies. So just to clarify, it's not that we're ignoring conflicts of interest. We are definitely covering conflicts of interest. They're just, this review process is not held to that, but we are holding ourselves to that process.
Okay, thank you. In EPPICnet, we did get a few questions, which I will go ahead and address now. The first question is whether assets for pain prevention can be considered. And the answer is yes, we can consider prevention treatments, but again, we want it targeted to specific conditions, and that gets a little bit more difficult to study, but we can certainly consider those sorts of therapeutics. If the asset is a generic drug being repurposed, submitted by an academic partner, what are the thoughts about phase 3 trial funding? EPPICnet is not set up for phase 3 trial funding, but there would likely be other opportunities through other NIH or HEAL initiatives that a person could apply for. But we have not incorporated further phase 3 trial or drug development into EPPICnet itself. The next question I got is whether the slides will be made available to participants on the call. We're going to post the whole webinar, and once that's posted, we can also get the slides out to everybody. Another question is whether or not, how to define the PI role requirements for application submissions by the sponsors. The PI for the clinical trial itself will be identified during the protocol preparation at stage 3. They will work together with the clinical coordinating center, the data coordinating center, and the applicant, the asset owner, to kind of define the roles. So they will have some input into the protocol and the clinical trial along with everybody else. This is really a very collaborative, interactive network in which everybody will work together. I have a question about compounds in phase 3 be considered. I am not quite sure what asked, so if that person could send me a note and clarify what you mean by phase 3, I'd appreciate it. Will clinical center hub PIs be able to provide input on design? Yes, so that's the same answer as in terms of the PI role. The clinical center, the hub PIs will be able to provide input on the development of the protocol, which includes trial design. Okay.
So for those of you on the phone who would like to do a verbal question, the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little chat head or a little participant head. You can click on that and see your participant list and unmute yourself to ask the question.
Okay, we just got an additional question about when the clinical center, coordinating center, data center, and hub announced. Those notices of award are being prepared now, and they will be announced as soon as those notices go out. We can't get that information until then.
I ask if I'm not clear what these attachments are. What is expected to be in there?
What attachments?
In the application form, there is.
What we expect to be submitted is the application form itself, the fillable PDF, once it's completed. And the application also asks for a letter of attestation that the applicant is the owner or has privileges to use and submit the asset. So we don't want somebody proposing an asset that they do not have the rights to submit for study. So it's those two documents that will get uploaded into ERA Commons.
For the sake of rapidity in the review process, for people who upload a lot of extraneous documents, those documents will not be included in the application for review.
So, but you mentioned 100 attachments.
Oh, no. All that Lori was trying to say is that ERA can accommodate a large number of attachments because other types of applications that require a lot of supporting paperwork. We're requesting 2. There will only be two attachments needed for our submission. Application itself and a letter of attestation of rights to submit.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
Yeah. So I got a couple of other questions. Who determines the subject number? If that means the number of participants in a study, that will be determined at the time of protocol design. Is there a requirement for the PI to be associated with the sponsor for the initial application? The answer to that is no. Does the program provide funding for manufacturing of the clinical trial materials? The answer is no. At this point, we are not approved for that sort of funding. If you have a particular question about that, please contact us separately and we'll see whether we can identify some other source, but right now EPPICnet is not funded for that. Let's see. So there's a question of if a drug can be targeted at a number of pain conditions, do you submit multiple applications? We would not like to see multiple applications for the same asset. Contact us and we'll talk about how to handle that type of situation.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Regarding drug formulation, I assume for any clinical trial we need placebo formulation versus drug. And I assume that will be part of the clinical trial.
We are discussing that now. Our understanding is that we will try to incorporate the costs of matched placebo preparation for a clinical trial into the OT funds to be awarded. Correct. To provide a reference for statements made. If that's referring to the preliminary application, we want a limited number of reference citations in support of the preclinical and clinical trials that have already been completed. I've just been reminded that we can also consider studies on biomarkers. That's something I did not mention previously. We are very interested in developing pain biomarkers as part of the studies incorporated into the pain therapeutic studies. So another question says, many therapeutics have multiple potential pain targets. If the hubs have particular expertise or large populations with particular populations, is it worth publishing that? There are multiple trials with same potential pain population. How will that be handled by an individual hub? So that's really addressed by what I said before about the advantage of a network like this is to be able to match the expertise needed with the asset and the needs of the trials and to help prioritize and mitigate competition among various potential populations. So the whole network will work together. It won't be incumbent on an individual hub to prioritize. The whole network will work on prioritizing and trying to make sure we have adequate populations to cover all the trials that are funded. I got a
another question along those lines.
Sure.
Would we know what the hubs are and what their expertise are and what their patient populations are?
We will certainly identify what the hubs are. At this point, almost all the hubs that have been identified so far have really broad-reaching pain expertise and populations. We've tried to select those that have proposed hubs and spokes with really the ability to participate in most of the clinical trials, but let me think about whether or not we'll make their particular populations available. Right now, they're pretty broad-reaching. And I don't think any hub will really be limited in its ability to get patients that are needed.
Where do we get that information?
The hub identification will be posted on our website as soon as the notices are released. So is migraine a painful condition? Yes. So migraine is indeed considered a painful condition, and we do have headache and in particular migraine expertise among our plan hubs and spokes. That's the end of my question list. If you have any other questions that come up after this meeting, another one just popped up. Does the PI need to have a clinical site, or can they be a project manager with clinical experience? For the company itself, the assets can be provided by anybody who has access to the drug and is authorized to submit it for study. So for a company, the applicant can be anybody the company feels is the appropriate applicant. We're not restricted to people with clinical experience on that side.
And to go beyond that, if they would like to clinical site, even though they're not part of EPPIC themselves, they can also come in and propose to participate as a clinical site as part of the trial. But that's something that would be worked out in the stage 3 protocol application.
Yes, so I also got a question about how the application and review of protocols developing biomarkers will be different from what we've just presented for phase 2 trials. The application, the preliminary application, and the subsequent application process covers biomarkers as well. So you'll be able to check the appropriate boxes and fill out the preliminary application for the biomarkers. The review will be very similar. As Marilyn pointed out, they will bring in reviewers with the expertise needed to review a biomarker study. So the review panel is flexible enough to cover all potential proposals that can come into us.
And to follow on that, we will be posting the roster for a upcoming meeting once the applications have been closed for that specific meeting. So if we have a due date of October 1st, we would then post the roster for the upcoming meeting so people would be able to see that on the EPPICnet webpage.
Okay, we have another question here, which is how many assets do we expect to be able to fund? To be able to run 5 clinical trials contemporaneously once we are up and running at a given time, with each trial estimated to last about 2 to 3 years. So that's what we're looking at. So for the time being, please send us your applications. We're very interested in trying there and really help address this need for alternative therapeutics. Will program fund advertising costs? Will the program fund advertising costs directed at recruiting subjects? That information is built into our network process. The recruitment of subjects will be handled by the hubs and spokes. The budget will be prepared with each protocol application, and if there's a need to put some money into recruiting costs, that will be considered at the time the protocol is written and we know what funds are needed and whether or not we have them readily available in our hubs. So it will potentially fund that if it's needed for a particular trial.